some years, but really burst into the light over the last 2 or 3 years, I suppose, for us. And our last conference, a union conference, there were a large number of motions about AI, and we'll be following those up. Automated journalism isn't that new. Programs capable of using limited information to produce passable reports, particularly of things like sports events and so on, have been used for some years. But it's the new large language models that are really taking things very much further, so that the limited power of those small-scale systems have now been surpassed. It covers the whole gamut of journalism. Photographs and videos that can be conjured up are probably the most dramatic representation of the power of AI. And I'm sure Nick of the Association of Photographers will have a good deal more to say about that, and I look forward to hearing that. But text journalists are also finding that AI is a mixed blessing and threat. Help with research, simplifying the job of text. It also has no moral compass, of course, and relies on training by analysing and reading vast amounts of text, some of which has probably been written by people in this room without appropriate payment, almost certainly, which is something that we are very concerned about in the NUJ. The threat to jobs and the theft of copyright work is a major problem. But as this is an ethics webinar, I'm particularly keen to consider the ethical issues of using AI, its inability to easily distinguish disinformation and misinformation from true information, its unreliability in terms of providing copy and pictures, and the importance of us checking what has provided is correct. All of these obviously are major problems for journalism. And when democracy is probably under more threat than it has been for some time, that is something to really be worried about. In a time when staff are being laid off from newsrooms at unprecedented numbers, there's reduced time to do the kind of checks that AI really requires. On the one hand, it's nice to be able to rely on its ability to gather and synthesize these large quantities of data, leaving us more time to go out, talk to witnesses, get the real human story. But actually, the fear is that it's going to be much more likely that we'll be obliged by penny-pinching managements to act as servants to AI, cleaning up its messes and checking its spewing forth clickbait that will raise readership numbers. There are a large number of ethical issues, but the biggest remains dis and misinformation. With it, will it help us be more ethical in our journalism or drive us down? And I think we need to work to try and make it as ethical as possible. I'll introduce our first guest speaker now. Dr. Felix Simon, a research fellow at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. He's a communications researcher and research fellow in AI and digital news at Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute. As a member of the Leverhulme Doctoral Centre Publication Beyond Print, he's been researching the implications of AI in journalism and the news industry since 2019, with a special emphasis on its use and reception. The shifting power dynamic between the news and technology sector and AI's role in misinformation and disinformation. So all important topics for us here today. He's published widely, has co-authored various research documents, holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Communications from the University of Oxford Internet Institute, and has presented work at various conferences, as well as giving evidence to inquiries at the UK House of Lords and House of Commons, press regulator Impress, and the United Nations. Felix, over to you. 10 minutes, please, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Chris. It's always a bit awkward to hear sort of your own CV sort of being read out to you, but I think that's something we have to all get through. Thank you all for having me. I will try and keep it reasonably short. I've basically got 4 points to make about what some of the current research tells us about, especially how audiences see the use of AI in news and what they expect of news organizations in this regard. And a lot of this draws on the Institute's own research, on my own research, on the research of colleagues. And I've basically tried to give you sort of a high-level summary, sort of where I've drawn out the 4 main points as they occur to me, sort of in the most important order. I think the first thing to say, what we've learned from survey research, focus group research, and qualitative interviews with people is that most people are generally uncomfortable for news to be created mostly using AI, but they are more comfortable with news mainly created by humans, but with some help from AI. And this may seem like a small distinction, but it matters a lot to audiences around the globe. In this case, this finding comes from a comparative survey we ran in 6 countries on nationally representative samples. But it's also something that has occurred in the focus groups and in the work of some colleagues at other universities. Second, in many ways, the topic and the type of AI use in the news matters to people. People are more uncomfortable with generative AI being used for some topics than for others. For example, we found that people are slightly more relaxed about generative AI being used for so-called soft news topics, things like entertainment and sport, but less so for topics like politics, business, or crime, where often the stakes are perceived to be much higher by the people who consume news. They also seem to be less worried about AI being used for behind-the-scenes tasks and much more concerned about some audience-facing tasks and products, especially where the risks that it could mislead them in some shape or form is considered particularly high. To give an example of what I mean here, in some of our focus group research, we found that people are fairly okay with AI used for instance, illustrations and graphics, but they are much more worried about photographs and AI-generated videos, where it is increasingly hard to tell the difference between what is real, what was actually taken with a camera somewhere, and what is completely computer-generated. Which, third, in many ways, brings us to the question of disclosure. What journalistic tasks should be labeled? Should they be labeled at all? All this has been widely discussed across the industry, not just in the UK, but also in other countries. It's hotly debated in research. And thankfully, we have some evidence at this point which can give us some answer to this question. And in many ways, increasingly, this evidence seems to indicate that audiences have actually quite nuanced understandings and views about when the use of AI in journalism needs to be disclosed and when this is not necessarily needed from their point of view. What we found at the Reuters Institute is that almost everyone wants at least some forms of content to be labeled, but there's very little consensus on exactly what should be labeled and what should not. In general, the things we could sort of tease out was that people see less of a need for labeling on behind-the-scenes tasks, things like journalists sort of using AI, for instance, to transcribe interviews, to help them with finding story ideas, with writing maybe a summary that they will then sort of reuse in another form and context. So all the things that don't necessarily are visible or become visible to audiences. But they're much more concerned and definitely want labeling for AI, where it's being used to create media or create content, especially content that is sort of facing them. And I increasingly think we can probably think of this as a spectrum. The higher the likelihood on the one hand of feeling misled through the use of AI, the higher the need to disclose and label. And sort of the opposite, the lower the likelihood of feeling misled, probably the lower the need to disclose. And again, from what we've learned in focus group research, for instance, lots of people say that behind the scenes tasks, that's where they are not as concerned about having this labeled. But for instance, if someone uses AI to create photorealistic imagery or even audio that sounds like sort of human created audio, that's where usually they want to see some form of labeling. It's important to point out that any form of disclosure is not necessarily without risk. Work done with my colleague Benjamin Toff at the University of Minnesota has shown that AI labels can lead to a minor decrease in trust in the content presented. So in many ways, as soon as you label, say, an article with the label, it was AI generated or AI was involved in the creation in some shape and form, we found a very sort of slight decrease in what people said when we asked them how much they trust the content. But in many ways, this was a very small effect, and it will likely remain small from what we know at the moment, and is probably sort of negligible in the grand scheme of things and the other factors that drive ultimately why people trust news and why people trust journalism. In many ways, when we ask people and when we look at research that asks people what they expect AI to do for them in the news contest. Many say in their sort of their expectation, it will make the news somewhat less trustworthy and cheaper for publishers to produce. But they also expect it to make news more up to date, somewhat easier to understand and more informative. And in many ways, when we look at some of the uses of AI, that sort of is sensible. It's not unreasonable that people think this, because yes, in theory, you can use AI, for instance, to make an article slightly easier to read. You can use AI to turn a written article into a piece that can be listened to, which for people with sort of visual impairments actually makes it easier to understand and easier to access. Now, of course, the fourth and final question is, do audiences actually trust journalism, the news, that it will use AI responsibly? And here again, we sort of see a mixed picture. In many countries, people think currently that journalists use generative AI for many tasks, but they often think that it's more for behind the scenes work and not so much for creating media. And in an interesting way, that view, at least when we did the survey, that sort of largely corresponded to how it was actually being used by the media at the time. That might shift as sort of time goes on and more news organizations become slightly more experimental when it comes to AI and when it comes to creating audience-facing products. But it was quite interesting that in general, sort of people had a sort of decent understanding of how journalists and news organizations were mostly using it. However, we also found in our last survey last spring that only 1/3 thought that journalists check the output of generative AI always or often, which is a bit of a harrowing finding in many ways, because of course you would want to hope that people have trust in journalists actually using this technology responsibly and doing a thorough check before they then use it and publish it or publish parts of it as an article. On the whole, people mainly expected AI to make news. Oh, sorry, lost my train of thought there. I think it's also important to say that there was little appetite for news mostly produced with generative AI, and few thought that generative AI will make the news sort of worth paying more for, which I think is an important lesson to publishers who've been very gung-ho about shoving generative AI into almost everything. And the big question, of course, is where does this leave us? And I think in summary, one can say that audience views of AI in news and their expectations of what news organizations should and shouldn't do are far from simplistic. We often sort of fall prey to the assumption that the people don't actually have a good idea of how it's being used. And what we've seen in the research is that this is actually not true. But the research sort of broadly also indicates that the responsible use of AI in line with existing journalistic norms is not necessarily going to score you extra points. In many ways, this is sort of the baseline assumption that many people have and the minimum of what they expect journalists to do. So it really underlines how important it is for news organizations and for journalists to use this technology in a responsible way. And I think for news organizations, this presents at the moment a sort of clear lesson. They can experiment with AI. It's probably even a good and prudent thing to do so, given that it does present some opportunities which might be beneficial, both for themselves and for the audiences who consume their journalism. But to do so in a way that keeps audiences on their side requires careful and transparent communication, and likely very clear highlighting and also demonstration of the benefits to audiences. Simply saying so is not necessarily going to cut it in the years going forward. And that's it for me, and I hope I stayed within time. We can't hear you, Chris. Unfortunately, you're muted. Okay, get a thumbs up. That's great.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't access my demute button. That was very good. Thanks very much, Felix. That was spot on. Our next guest is Nick Dunmur, a photographer and head of business and legal at the Association of Photographers. I'm sure he'll have plenty to say about what you were talking about with the difference between illustrations and photographs, Felix. A very important point. He's been a professional photographer all his working life and spent 6 years as a non-executive director of the AOP board, 2 years of which was as chair. He's been involved with various working groups and committees concerned with copyright and photographers' rights at the AOP and other organisations, including the British Copyright Council and the British Photographic Council. And it provides business and legal advice to AOP members on matters relating to professional practice, licensing, issues with copyright and infringements. This service is free to AOP members. As a practicing photographer of commissioned and NUJ work, commissioned and personal work, Nick is an ideally placed to look at the problems from a photographer's perspective. I know we've got quite a few photographers here today. I'm sure they'll be really interested to hear this, Nick. I certainly will be. Over to you. 10 minutes, please.
Great, thank you, Chris, and hello, everybody. There's some names on here that I recognise, and which is nice to see everybody, and nice to meet everybody else for the first time as well. So, thank you, Felix, too, for leading us in to this discussion. It was interesting that a lot of the points that you were talking about in the research that you referenced, where people felt more comfortable with the use of AI, was in roles that supported what was already happening or taking place, rather than anything that was replacing. So this idea of technology supporting human activity rather than supplanting it, I think, is quite important. It's also important, I think, to look at how quickly the two letters AI have become a marketing ploy for a great deal of business activity. A lot of what is badged as AI is a rebranding exercise on technology that has been around for some time, and for whatever reason, the businesses that are engaged with that particular platform, whether it's a bit of software retouching, raw processor, if we're talking about photography, spell checking, all of that kind of stuff, that might happen locally on your own machine as opposed to referencing any external data set, has now been rebranded as with an AI tool set, presumably to help with sales and to drive the sort of continued interest in that. For me, going back to the sort of the core issue of ethics, first of all, I suppose, I mean, one of the first questions to ask is whose code of ethics do we talk about when we're looking at the ethical use of AI? I think there is a lot of desire amongst the tech sector, particularly from what I've seen, to try and come up with a code of ethics that is a singular sort of list, if you like, a prescriptive list of do's and don'ts. But as I'm sure we'd all agree, ethics doesn't quite work like that. I mean, we all have our own sets of values, where there will be a great deal of overlap between a lot of us, given the areas that we are working in terms of communicating stories and narratives to an audience, and how important the idea of veracity and authenticity is within that. Authenticity is, it's an apposite word, but it's unfortunately become rather overused by marketing departments as well. So a lot of our vocabulary has been hijacked for other uses, but I think in this context, authenticity is useful. Forgetting about sort of defining a definitive code of ethics, I think it's important to look at the different sectors in which the technology is being deployed. And when I talk about AI, I'm actually talking about generative AI as a particular sort of subset of it, by which I'm talking about text to image platforms, text to video, text to text, which is something like a large language model like ChatGPT or Claude or some of those kind of platforms, text to audio, you know, anything that where you would sit down at a computer, enter a prompt and get a piece of content, for want of a better word, out of that particular platform, whatever it is we're using. So within the generative AI sort of faction, if you like, there is an issue of copyright. And that starts particularly from the data set that had been used to train that particular platform. As I'm sure many of you will already be aware, a generative AI platform doesn't exist on its own. It needs to be trained on data. The more data, the better. And as far as text to image generators are concerned, that data, of course, is my photographs and anybody else's photographs who happens to have work published online. It won't come as any surprise to people, I'm sure, that one of the biggest data sets, the Leon 5B data set, which contains 5.85 billion images, is a general sort of scrape of the internet of any public-facing work that is out there. Anything that's behind a paywall or a login is less difficult, is less easy to get hold of, obviously. But there's a huge ethics question there as to the fact that work, our work, has been taken and used. And then that leads into the next sort of point that I want to make, which is that the outputs from those generative AI platforms are in the main then used to compete directly with the human authors who created the work on which it was trained. And I think that is a really big issue. You know, we do not want to be in a position of human livelihoods being chucked away on the basis that a machine can reproduce and do something much more cost effectively. It doesn't always come down to the bottom line for one good reason. The fact is that if you look at the economic activity of the creative industries, the UK creative industries in particular are a success story. It's about 125 billion gross value add per year that the UK creative industries contributes. And if you take an example, a sort of a little microcosm of a piece of photographic activity, and I'm going to use photography because that's my area of expertise. And let's say we talk about a fashion shoot where maybe we have 10 different creators involved or creative businesses involved in the production of that particular piece of work. We have a model or two, we have hair and makeup, we have stylist, we have photographer, we have assistant, we have lighting, we have somebody doing catering, we have a location manager maybe, you know, all the other sort of people that are contingent on making that work happen. That's quite a lot of economic activity that's taking place there. I asked one of our agents the other day, just, you know, a very simple fashion shoot, what might be a budget that might be set aside for that? And she said, oh, about 20,000 maybe to cover that kind of activity. Now, that's a lot of money if a client is paying for that. And I can see quite easily the attraction of going to a generative AI platform to try and get something for a few $100, if that, maybe just a couple of months subscription fees, would at face value be very attractive indeed. But if you think about it, that reduction in economic activity, that 20,000 is, you know, that's a reduction in the size of the UK creative industries as a whole. And because it's a reduction in the size, you know, those 10 people, those 10 individuals, those 10 small businesses, the tax revenues that they're paying reduces. So the exchequer is the poorer for that reduction in value. Add to that the fact that most of the generative AI platforms are not headquartered in the UK. So all those subscription fees simply get offshored. There's no tax being paid by the likes of OpenAI or Midjourney on the subscriptions that people might pay to those businesses in order to use them. So we've got the data sets as one aspect of it. We've got the competition element between human and synthetic output, if I can use that phrase. We also have a trust issue, as Felix had mentioned, and it's interesting that even within the world of advertising, with which I'm most familiar, brands particularly, those, you know, again, using that word authenticity, are very keen not to alienate their audiences. And it's quite telling that a number of campaigns, Coca-Cola, you may have seen, did a Christmas AI generated moving image advert, which was roundly derided. A couple of other large brands have produced generative AI campaigns which have backfired because their audiences have felt insulted that they're being presented with generative AI work instead of something that has been created human to human. And I think that's an interesting element to this discussion as well, particularly where advertising might be seen as a sort of smoke and mirrors and generally something that is not in everybody's best interests particularly. I think the other thing that doesn't get talked about to any sort of degree is the environmental impact of the technology. And we know that, for example, an image generation process requires about the same amount of energy as it does to charge a smartphone from 0 to 100%. So if you're sat at Midjourney, you're typing away, you're prompting, you're maybe doing 2 or 3 iterations of that. That amount of energy that's being consumed to generate that output as a result of those prompts, that's quite substantial. If you then recognize that there are about 15 billion synthetic images on the internet at the moment, and this is since the generative AI platforms sort of first appeared maybe 2.5, 3 years, getting on for 3 years ago now. 15 billion images in that length of time. That's quite some going, I think, when you add all of that kind of energy consumption up. Using ChatGPT, there was an article I read on Arxiv, which had been researchers had worked out that a ChatGPT interaction, so it didn't say how long that interaction was, but a short series of interactions with ChatGPT required about half a litre of fresh water as cooling for the computer systems and the data center that were providing that technology and that platform. So I think in the light of a climate crisis, to be looking at embracing, and that's a word that the tech sector use a great deal as well, to be looking at embracing a technology that is incredibly carbon intensive, potentially, unless of course it's using renewable energy, but we know that that's not up to speed by any means across the planet at the moment. I think that's a big issue that needs to be kept in the forefront of our thinking as well. It's quite pertinent, this webinar taking place at this particular time, because as I'm sure many of you will also know, the UK government is consulting on copyright and AI at this very moment. The consultation closes on the 25th of February. And indeed, the House of Commons are debating copyright and AI and the consultation on Monday, which if anybody is of a mind to write to their MP to point out the inadequacies of the government's consultation framework, the fact that they are steering us down an option 3, which is a broad text and data mining exception to copyright for AI purposes with an opt-out, and we know that opt-outs are completely unworkable for individual creators, then please do. That's my sort of political plug for the evening. Make that point, because the more MPs that are aware of it before Monday's debate, the better. So yeah, I think, you know, we have the data set, we have the actual technology itself, we have the issue of trust, we have the issue of humans versus machines, if you like, and the very real tangible aspect of that, which is the economic value that we as humans add to the overall sort of UK's economy, and the idea that somehow using this technology to supplant what we do is going to be a good thing, which clearly it's not. It's going to see a huge reduction in the value of that. I think you up there, Nick. That's possibly all I've got as a top level sort of, you know, we can unpick some of those elements in more detail, I'm sure, but I'll leave it for now, Chris.
Lovely, thanks, Nick. I know we're really asking you, all three of you, to really condense a huge subject down into a tiny nugget, but there were some really, really useful points there, and I know people will want to come back and pick some of those up. Our next speaker is Dr. Mathilde Pavis. She's an international expert in intellectual property, data and ethics, and is an advisor and legal consultant on generative artificial intelligence in the creative industries. She advises the United Nations, UNESCO, unions, as well as AI companies in the UK and Europe. She trained as a lawyer in France and in the UK and completed a PhD on the legal protection of individuals' faces, voice and body online at the University of Exeter. Her PhD research spotted a gap in the law on the protection of individuals against unauthorised digital imitations. She holds a personal chair at the university, or held a personal chair at the University of Exeter, and is now an associate professor in law at the University of Reading. Great of you to join us, Mathilde. over to you for the next 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I think journalists have had, in many ways, have been taking the first punch. I mean, we say that a lot of the creative industries, but within the creative industries, I think the first impact in terms of data mining and model training has been on journalistic work. So it makes it doubly relevant for us to talk about that now, I think. So my sort of contribution and my prompt, if I turn into a human ChatGPT, was to talk about what I think the government should do in order to protect journalists in particular, right? The creative workers that you all are, whether you're working in text or visual or a combination. And that's, as Nick mentioned, is very fitting. And I think, Nick, you mentioned about us all embracing technology. I think the government's words, in fact, in the UK were unleashing AI in the UK, which is it has a particular flavor in terms of the phrasing. So with the government, I think there are three background elements or factors that I would like them to have in mind as they consider reforming both copyright law, but also investing in infrastructures and doing other policy work in this space, in order to cater to the needs of journalists in this space. So the first one would be the fact that, and those are all factors that don't stack in the best deck possible for you, as you'll find out, as I'm sure you're aware. So the first is the fact that your rights to your work, whether in images or in the text, is almost always acquired and aggregated and in the hands of the media company owning or running a newspaper, whomever you worked for, either in an employee-employer relationship or in a client that's commissioned you to do work. And because that will be a function of what we call a buyout, a transfer of all rights for all purposes or very widely written purposes and clauses. So that's one factor that's really important to keep in mind because it will play an important role later. The second factor that's already been touched upon that is problematic and making you particularly vulnerable as journalists, as a stakeholder group in this conversation, is the fact that at the moment, AI developers are accessing data to train their model by crawling rather than by licensing. There have been deals in licensing that are being cut. Those are by far the minority. And actually, those licensing deals have started with news publishing. And I'll get onto some of the problematic bits in the middle later. And so when data is crawled rather than licensed, the opportunity for the journalist, the human creative worker or creator at the source of the content to either consent or receive payment or both is bypassed. So practically, you don't get the opportunity to bargain, to negotiate, to consent. And that's the consequence of crawling, which is the very first act or moment in the life cycle of an AI model creation today. And the third sort of background factor, which also doesn't help your position, is the fact that there is no real relationship between AI companies or the tech company on the one hand, if we can use a broad label, and the news industry on the other. So we're not looking at two stakeholder groups or two communities with a long-standing past relationships at discussing, debating, negotiating industry disputes or having a value exchange. This is a brand new relationship, which is not off to a great start if we consider the fact that your content, what you create for a living and what you make a livelihood out of, has been used and accessed by them, by the AI companies, without your consent and through crawling, which is basically bypassing any conversation. So those three factors are the background that the government needs to be aware of and respond to, which in my experience, I'm a bit surprised to consider hasn't been the case, because as they go down the rabbit holes of the in and outs of the copyright regulation in the UK, they're also not zooming out and looking at the big picture. So why are these things a problem is that in the ideal world where a licensing deal happens, and some have happened in the news industry, between an AI company and those who own the rights, that often will not involve individual journalists, right? Because your rights to your copyright has been acquired and you've been leveraged out of your rights by virtue of the contract you have with the publisher and your newspaper, etc. And so at the moment, the first contract you have with your engager, your employer, your client, doesn't always rarely includes a remuneration right to cover AI training should it happen later. So basically, that means that we see no trickle down economics if we buy into the concept in the first place, raining from the deal that may happen between the AI company and sort of the mother company or the media company that owns newspapers, magazines, and other publication and titles. Because we've had about, I think, by my count, about 10 to 12 news-related or news-dominant licensing deals made. That's not a lot. The terms of these deals we don't know, but I'm yet to hear from a journalist, a photographer, or a writer that they have received royalties or usage fees based as a result of training. It doesn't suggest that it's not possible. It's just saying that at the moment, that's a weakness in the contractual chain that ties you, the title you work for, the client, and then those that then manage those rights. That needs to be addressed by the government in order for whatever licensing or remuneration model that comes in to work for the humans involved in creating the content that is being used later by AI company. So that's sort of a first point. Then the issue of crawling is a real one. Is how do we, the question to government is to how do they make sure that licensing, which will provide the highest chances of a journalist to be remunerated and, ask for their consent before their content is used in a context they've not agreed on. How can the government incentivize AI companies to license rather than mine? Today in the UK, let's be very, very clear, because this is something that I think is a little bit confusing in the government policy work that's come out, whether you're looking at the AI action plan or the consultation. The notion that UK law is unclear in relation to data mining is false. UK law is very clear on this point. Unless you're mining content protected by copyright for the purpose of non-commercial research, you need the consent and the permission of the rights holder. Now, the rights holder in a journalist position is often not the journalist, but potentially their newspaper or the rights holder organization. We can debate that, but that's likely, so that's speaking to point one that I've just mentioned. Now, the government, as mentioned by Nick, is proposing to loosen that rule to make it an opt-out system, whereby by default you agree to training, you've consented unless you opt out. We know from the experience in the UK that doesn't work for various practical and legal reasons. And so my opinion is that the government should look at another alternative. Licensing is one, and in that context, you need to make licensing more convenient for an AI company than crawling. And you can do that by doing two things. You can make it so that the data sets you license are more attractive because they're better curated, structured, prepared for AI training than what is crawled online. Crawled data is expensive to prepare for AI training, and also is has a limited range in what's in it in terms of the type of content people publish online is not as rich as the catalog that rights holders have and could make available for AI training data sets, which could then make AI models perform better because tailored to different source training. The other aspect that makes licensing more attractive than crawling that the government, I think, seems to be missing is that licensing will cover you not only for copyright, but also for the other rights that can exist in the content used for training purposes, such as GDPR and privacy. A lot of images, a lot of video footage will carry more than copyright and performance rights within it. It will also carry people's personal data, which is covered by GDPR, in a way that if you introduce an opt-out, you'll be covered on a copyright, but the opt-out doesn't apply to other rights that may subsist in the content that also need to be cleared in order for an AI company to move on through without risks of infringement, etc., to obtain the like clean model that they're after. And so where the government is trying to add to legal clarity by lifting copyright, they may end up with more confusion because they will give AI developers the impression that the opt-out covers all of the rights that there is in content, where it's not true. Especially for audiovisual content, if there's a face, if there's a voice, if there's a body, you cannot go and mine and train without clearing GDPR. Clearing GDPR is new because GDPR wasn't thought in this kind of licensing context. And this is why seeking data sets pre-licensed by a union, by collective management organizations, is more suited to deal with those technical issues than just an opt-out and using crawling bots, understanding that. So those are the sort of two main things I'd like the government to consider, is to look at contractual arrangements between journalists and their rights holders or their employers or anyone who's aggregating journalists' rights, to then authorize training and making sure the remuneration goes back to the human creator at the source of the value chain, at the beginning of the value chain. And the second is to invest in infrastructure and support for the creative industries, including organizations representing journalists, to set up that licensing system that will be convenient to AI developers, but will not come at the cost of diluting the rights of journalists, and work for both of them. And I don't believe the opt-out system will do that at all. And I think this view is shared by scholars, whether we're looking at law, creative industries, media scholars, even computer scientists, and believe this is necessarily the option. And what I find particularly interesting is also the fact that now we're seeing studies where factual content, so primarily news-based content and journalistic work, is being used, at least in text, as the primary source of training for large language models, when the prompting that's coming from GPT users and the like is actually about creative content. So we see a misalignment between the data sets that are used for training and the prompting and the type of content that people want out of a ChatGPT and the like. And this type of technical misalignment could also be fixed with licensing.
I'll wind you up, Mathilde, please.
Yep. And so I think that will probably be the 2 points I'd like to see. And I would ditto Nick's comments about reaching out to your MP, stressing the needs of the government to really do a thorough impact assessment on you as a profession and as a stakeholder group, together with the rest of the creative industries. On this, you're beautifully aligned, actually, across sectors in a way that perhaps hasn't happened so often in the past.
Thanks very much, Mathilde. You're quite right with that last point. That's fascinating and really interesting stuff there. We're open to questions now, colleagues. I'll end a couple of minutes before time just to give our guests a chance to come back on some of the points. If you want to bounce a question to a particular speaker, if you can say who that is, please, and I'll ask them to answer it. We've got somebody got their hand up already. I'll ask you to put your hands up, or you can put your question on chat, and I'll pick it up there. So, there's a question here. Government consultation. They seem to have made up their mind about copyright issue. How do we stop this? I don't know, Mathilde, do you want to pick that one up, or Nick, or both of you?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, the thing is to respond to the government consultation. Anybody can do that, or various trade organisations and bodies will no doubt be doing it on behalf of their membership. So yeah, I think I believe from speaking to officials at the IPO that they've already had a huge number of responses, many more than they were anticipating, I think. So yeah, it might appear that it's a done deal, that the government are wanting to pursue a broad TDM exception with the possibility for individual rights holders to opt out their works, but it's not by any means done and dusted. And I think as Mathilde mentioned, the creative industries as a whole are very broadly aligned on the response to the government's consultation, which is it doesn't always work out that way. You know, other more sort of niche consultations see a broader range of views, but this is something much more fundamental.
Thanks for that, Nick. Did you want to come in, Mathilde?
Yes, and if I might add, you have an ally in Parliament, and a good few MPs are taking the line that the proposals are unbalanced and not appropriate for the creative industries as well as other sectors. Leading that charge, if I can call it that, would be the DCMS Commons Committee, chaired by Caroline Dinenage. So she has the advantage of now being a Conservative MP, so she can be more forceful with her lines. And they're very, very keen to hear from everyone and anyone that has evidence of impact of what's going on that could help them push back against some aspects of the government proposals. They've been very forceful about that so far. So that will help. It may help and give a bit of hope to say that an attempt at broadening the data mining exception, which is this conversation about the opt-out, happened about 2 years ago under the Conservative government, and it got stopped in Parliament largely through and thanks to creative industries lobby. That was very effective. So hopefully it'll be effective a second time, but I should also stress that at the time the proposals were a bit underbaked, and that helped the stopping the conversation there before it took on. This time the government is indicating a much clearer and firmer line, and so that it will take more efforts to push back against that, I think.
Thanks, Mathilde. I mean, every member here ought to write and take up the consultation. If you go onto the government's website, the consultation will be there, and there'll be questions for you to answer, but I think we'll try and get something out centrally to help you formulate what you need to be writing about. We've got a question for you, Mathilde. How do you have your licensing proposals work for freelancers? To talk about that a little.
So licensing for work for freelancers, in a way, technically, you have more room to maneuver to have retain your copyright. But licensing for freelancers can still happen through collective management organizations if you're a member of those groups, or through a union if they represent you in that way. So that will depend where your affiliation or membership might fall into, depending on the type of work you do. So that should be applicable to you regardless of whether you're a freelance or employee. When you're an employee, if you are your copyright will rest with your employer. It doesn't mean game over for you on licensing, but it does sort of limit your licensing or bargaining power on that. And on that, you're not alone. So take performers. The vast majority of them are freelancers, and their rights are managed through collective bargaining, and that's very effective. So you'd look at establishing a similar agreement, obviously on the topic of AI training, prompting, generating, and the like, on top of previous collective agreements you have.
Thanks, Mathilde. Another question we've got is, how would you suggest dealing in this consultation with the risk AI poses of creating false news content, both written and image/video? And Felix, would you want to come in on that one?
Sorry, could you just briefly repeat the question? I was just
sure.
to add a hyperlink.
How would you suggest dealing in this consultation? I assume they mean the parliamentary consultation, with the risk AI poses of creating false news content, both written and image/video. I mean, it's quite a broad question, I have to say, but if there's a little bit that you can pick out, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's something actually for the current government consultation to look at, because in many ways, I think it would make sense to sort of focus on one thing at a time. And as Mathilde has reminded us so wonderfully, the sort of questions of licensing deals, copyright, and all that jazz, that's already a really, really big topic. And I'm not sure if sort of slapping something else into the mix is necessarily going to help. It also raised the questions of how would you regulate that in the first place? How would you sort of try and encode something like truth into model, which from a technical point of view is very complicated, and from a philosophical standpoint, quite another thing to do, because it raises the question, what is truth? Who defines certain things? And of course, there are certain institutional facts sort of institutional knowledge that we can probably argue should in some way be sort of encoded into those systems. That is happening as far as I can tell. But of course, there's some other things, for instance, the way we have opinions about some matters of sort of public concern that are not necessarily right or wrong, where you can't sort of draw a clear line, and where it really depends on the context if they would count as mis or disinformation or not. So I'm not really sure that this is something that should be considered in this current consultation, which is not to say that it's not something the government or other institutions shouldn't be looking at more broadly, at least in sort of encouraging those companies to build systems and provide models that broadly sort of correspond to institutional facts and knowledge, and as much as possible try and give users something that is accurate and factually correct rather than misinformation or false information.
That's Felix. And Nick, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, just on the point about in this consultation, there's not a huge amount of scope in the questions that are proposed by the government, and it's worth noting as well that this consultation straddles various government departments. It's not just the IPO, it's DCIT and it's DCMS as well who are behind this. It's certainly worth making the point about labelling, about transparency, and about all of those other elements. And there are some initiatives that people are attempting to bring into play, like C2PA initiative, content credentials, etc., etc. But even those are not robust enough. You know, metadata, as we all know, is easy to edit, to remove, to change. There's a huge amount of work that still needs to be done before we've got any element of certainty about being able to identify something that's generative AI versus something that has been human authored. And then, of course, you've got the whole range of activity in between where people might be using generative AI tools to add something to the original that they had made on whatever platform or whatever technology. So there's never going to be a sort of a series of hard defined sectors which work conveniently falls into. As with many things copyright, there's always grey areas, you know, fuzzy boundaries with all of this kind of stuff. I mean, one of the things that I think somebody in the chat had mentioned about individuals' rights, I think is quite pertinent as well. And there are discussions about personality rights, which have started to take place, particularly not just in relation to data protection. And I put a link to the ICO's response to their consultation that they ran last year on AI and data protection. And I think actually the ICO would probably make a better regulator for anything going forward than the IPO would on the current sort of evidence. But Guernsey has a personality right, which is quite interesting and perhaps worth exploring in more detail, not only to do with individuals, but to do with particularly where a photographer or an author has devoted a lot of time and their own energy and expense at developing a style of their own. That is the thing that defines them and makes them different to somebody else. And the replication of an individual's style of creative work is hugely problematic, where a generative AI platform can output something in the same style as an original human author. And protecting, you know, style is not part of the copyright regime. We know that, you know, you can't protect that element of it. You can only protect the physical expression of the idea. So there's a lot of interesting discussion to have, I think, along those lines as well. And I think as far as the consultation's concerned, option 0, which is leave it as is and do nothing, is probably that might be a second best option. I think the most preferred one would probably be option 1, which is a sort of proper opt-in basis, but with some caveats. Clearly, as Mathilde says, you know, copyright law is very clear. You can do all rights are already reserved. We shouldn't need to reserve our rights again. They are already reserved under UK copyright law.
Thanks, Nick. That's very useful. We've got another question one about, is there a pro forma anywhere for responses? Well, there are questions on the consultation which you can drive, and I think we'll try and get some questions through the union to send out so that people can pick those up. But also ask, can you comment on the use of the word photo as opposed to image? AI output is image only, even the latter. Thanks so much. So difference between a photo and image.
Yeah, and an AI output is it's a synthetic content. It's a synthetic image. It's certainly not a photograph, as far as I'm concerned.
No, I saw a logo for a wildlife charity the other day, and it had a picture on its logo of a fox, which seemed to have 5 legs. And I could only assume that this was an attempt to avoid paying some poor photographer for a nice picture of a fox. But maybe they just like foxes with 5 legs. I'm not sure what that was about. We're coming to the end of our time, colleagues. Shall I start with you again, Felix? Is there anything you want to say on the basis of what you've heard from anybody so far?
No, I'm just really thankful that people are sharing their views. I think it's really important to hear those voices. I think on the question of the government consultation, I sort of would chime in with Nick and Mathilde. I think the best thing you can do is make your voices heard through bodies like the union, through the consultation itself, by contacting your MP and basically making those points, because the other side, quote unquote, will certainly be doing this as well. And I think that's the best way to sort of handle this with the powers that we all are sort of given as citizens at the end of the day.
Thanks, Felix. Nick, any last thoughts?
Yeah, just reiterate that point of contacting your MP. Regardless of, I think one of the things that I read in the press that was attributed to Keir Starmer, I don't know if he actually said this, but it was that AI was going to be mainlined into the veins of the nation. And I found that analogy extremely disturbing. I don't know about anybody else, but I think there is a real threat to the creative industries, and certainly the biggest we've seen since the Hargreaves Review, which some of you, I'm sure, will remember. And possibly as far as technology versus human endeavour is concerned.
Thanks, Nick. Mathilde, a few last thoughts.
There we go. My time to struggle with the unmute button. No, I think I don't want to repeat our previous comments. I think get your thoughts and views on the record. As many case studies or examples of what you've experienced and what you've come across that's problematic or even that works well will be very welcome. This is the type of submissions that gets the most traction in my experience with the Intellectual Property Office. I think there's a need for a narrative shift, and I can't think of anyone better than journalists to help the government with that, to give them another way to relate to AI and another arc to that story and what's going on as the current kind of Google plug that seems to have lodged into Keir Starmer's brain and the leaders of the pack. You may be taking advantage of the current split in leadership between the agency of DCIT and DCMS that have slightly different views on the matter, and DCMS is more supportive of your view, and that divide and conquer type strategy might help us.
Thanks, Mathilde. Thanks to all the speakers for giving up your time, for coming and really informing us so well. I mean, I've learned a lot, and I hope everyone else has too. Clearly, we all need to get stuck into the consultation and make it very clear to the government that we feel very strongly about this, and we will try and get some advice out to all members to help them with that. Thank you all for attending. It's good to see so many people interested in this huge new development. Thank you all for attending. Hope you have a really good evening. Go back and put your